Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We are in Isaiah 7, if you would want to turn there, following this theme of Immanuel. We're going to talk about Immanuel as the sign. Signs, I've been thinking about those. What are they for? What are signs for? Really, they're to convey information, right? A sign stands for something that someone out there thinks we need to know. That's why signs exist. I started looking for some examples of signs, and you don't have to look far. There are signs everywhere. Right in the foyer, as you walk in the door, there are all kinds of signs in there, if you've noticed. Tells us about the Christmas outreach books that are there on the table, about the Advent devotional guides, about pre-service prayer, about the upcoming workday, at the homeless shelter. There's signs that direct us to the sanctuary, to the restrooms, to the office, and to the wall with all the church pamphlets and information on it. You just look around. There's signs everywhere. I walked into my office. I found this sign. You know, you've seen this. This was the saying, some of you know, was a motivational poster produced by the British government in 1939 in preparation for World War II. It was intended to raise the morale of the British public because they were threatened by air attacks, you know, from Germany. What you may not know is although 2.5 million copies of these posters, much larger than this, were printed, the poster was only recently discovered. It wasn't displayed very much at all in Britain, and they were completely forgotten about. They were discovered in 2000. One of them was at a bookstore in a little town, and it has since been reissued. You know, you see this saying all over the place. It's been reissued by private companies. We've all seen it as a decorative theme. This is a genuine copy from Hobby Lobby, right there. I found more signs at home. Some of you will recognize this circle. Anyway, this OK was used for decades to advertise General Motors used car lots. There was one on every GM lot, and a lot of us remember those. Some we all still know. You know, the blue oval, right? You know what a Ford sign is. You know what that looks like. You see them on the road. You see them everywhere. Some signs have become so ubiquitous that all we need to see is the shape, and we know what it means. And we know the larger truth behind the shape, right? Like, of course, this. We know this shape, and we know what it stands for. Or how about this shape? You know what this is, right? I mean, all you need to do is see the shape of the sign, and we know what it says. But this one is a little tricky. This one is different. We found this at a yard sale a few years ago. That one is a little tricky. Signs are put up to inform us. They are put up to give us direction. They are put up to tell us what to expect, to encourage us, and also to warn us. Ultimately, they exist to help us. They're not there to hurt us. They are there to help us. Last Sunday morning, we looked at Matthew 1 and how Matthew describes Joseph's encounter with Immanuel. That's our theme for Advent. We talked about how God with him did, at least initially, the opposite of what most of us would have expected. Instead of bringing serenity and calm to Joseph's life, Jesus' presence wound up changing everything about Joseph's life and expectations, his whole experience. And so Joseph was left with the choice when they came in the dream and the angels announced to him what was going to happen. Joseph had a choice. Will I accept Immanuel? Will I accept God's witness? We sort of made up that word. Will I accept God's witness and the changes that it's going to bring in my life, or will I insist on going my own way without God and his plans and his ideas? That was the choice Joseph had. And of course, we know that Joseph quickly did, and he continued to do, everything God asked of him. And so he became for us a tremendous example of a teachable, pliable disciple. Joseph shows us what a faith-filled, obedient Christ follower should be, and all of that was before Jesus was even born. Okay? But in the midst of that Matthew text, there is this reference to the prophet Isaiah. Matthew tells us in verse 22, he says, all of this took place, all of this with Joseph, all of it took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. And then he quotes Isaiah chapter 7, which says, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. So, why does Matthew appeal to Isaiah? Why does he even include it in there? The simple answer is because it's the best explanation of what happened to Mary and Joseph. It's the only real explanation, actually. It was just that evident to Matthew. Did you know that before Matthew made that tie of Isaiah to Mary and Joseph, there's no evidence that anyone had ever before seen that Isaiah verse as a fulfillment of the coming Messiah? But Matthew does see it that way. He did and does and wrote it for us because he found it to be evidence for what happened to Joseph and Mary. The account of the birth of Jesus was already well established by the time Matthew wrote his gospel here. And everybody knew the circumstances of it were strange. Everybody realized that. Mary and Joseph knew it. And all their families and all their friends knew it. There was something about this conception and this marriage that was abnormal. And I'm sure some in Mary and Joseph's circles believed the stories that they told about the angels and the Holy Spirit and all that. And I'm equally sure that others around them did not believe it. But Matthew sees the explanation right here in the prophet. And he writes so that you and I and everybody that reads him can understand that though widely missed at the time, God had long ago spoken of this event that would come. In fact, clear back in Isaiah's day, God had put up a sign to show us, to guide us, to inform us about how we ought to proceed and how we needed to think about this Jesus born to Joseph and Mary. You might say God built the sign, but the prophet Isaiah installed it. In Isaiah chapter 7, that's where we are. This was the situation in this day, in Isaiah's day. This was 700 years before Matthew. I mentioned that last week. The kingdom of Israel that Saul and David and Solomon had reigned over had by this time been divided into two. There was the north called Israel, or Ephraim. And then there was the south called Judah. Ahaz was the king of Judah at this point. And in this moment, he and his nation were being attacked. And by his own brothers, of all people, by the northern kingdom of Israel, who had aligned themselves with another nation, the nation of Aram, or your Bible might say Syria. It's the same place, same nation. They had aligned against Judah, and things were not going well for Judah. So one day during the conflict, King Ahaz, we're told, was in the area of, verse 3 there says, the upper pool, which is probably part of an aqueduct that brought water into the city of Jerusalem. He probably went there to see how much water was still there, because that's an important thing to know. Since wars in that day involved sieges of cities, and you could only last in a besieged city as long as you had water. So Ahaz wanted to know how much water he had. And God sent Isaiah there to the pool to speak to Ahaz. He sent him to encourage him. He sent him to convince him that Israel and Syria were nowhere near the threat to him that their reputations suggested. And to say that as long as Ahaz would trust in God, well, Judah would be just fine. And Ahaz would be just fine. And God would help him. And he would overcome their enemies if only Ahaz would trust him. And in order to prove it, God wanted to give Ahaz a sign. A divine indication of the legitimacy of the promise. So Isaiah invites Ahaz, there in verse 10, he says, ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths or the highest heights. In other words, there is no limit to what you can ask of God here, King Ahaz. Just ask him. Ask him for something that shows you his faithfulness. Ask him for a sign that he is with you, and he will give that to you. Now, if a known prophet of God came to most of us, particularly when we're in a time of great distress, and that prophet said, hey, God has your back in this. He's with you, and he'll prove it to you. You can ask him for any indication, any sign you like, and he will take that as faith that you believe him and that he will give then that sign to you. That's a real life genie in a bottle, right? And you don't even have to rub on it. If that opportunity were presented to us, any of us, I would hope that we would jump at it. But remarkably, Ahaz does not. He doesn't. His response to Isaiah appears to be very pious. He says, oh no, he says, I will not put the Lord to the test. That's Deuteronomy 6:16, which you remember Jesus himself appeals to when he's in the wilderness while the devil was tempting him there. But in this business of testing God, here's the difference between Ahaz and Jesus. Unlike Jesus, where Satan is asking Jesus to test God, God here himself is asking Ahaz to test him. And Ahaz is refusing. So even though the response from Ahaz and Jesus is the same, the motivation is just 180 degrees different, you see. Jesus' motive is obedience. Ahaz's motive is disobedience. So, why would Ahaz not listen to God and ask for the sign? Why would he not do that? It is the very same reason people don't listen to God today. His mind was already made up as to what he was going to do. Ahaz was going to align himself with another nation, Assyria, of all people, a far more dangerous crowd than either Aram or Israel. Ahaz had already settled that matter in his mind. And you see, any evidence that Isaiah might want to bring to speak against that decision that Ahaz has already made, that would just mess up his plans. Ahaz may well have said to Isaiah, look, my mind is already made up. Don't confuse me with the facts. I don't want to hear it. Here is a blank check being laid before Ahaz. But even that would not move him. It would not move him. Why? Why would it not move him? Simple. Because Ahaz had no faith. No faith. He had no faith in God. He was not interested in having faith in God. And nothing Isaiah could say or do was going to change that. The reason? Evidence cannot create faith. Evidence can bolster faith. Evidence can confirm faith. Evidence can even multiply faith. But evidence cannot initiate faith. It's the difference between addition and multiplication. Anything that you multiply by 0 is still 0. There has to be at least a spark of faith to begin with. But where there is none, where there's no faith, evidence is unwelcome. And it's never going to be heard. That's why Ahaz had no interest in hearing from God. And that was apparent to Isaiah. It was also reprehensible to Isaiah. And it caused him to reply with this anger, obvious anger. He says, well, you may not want it, but just the same, the Lord is going to give it to you. He's going to give you a sign. Verse 13 there, hear now, he says, you house of David, because Ahaz represents the whole nation. Hear, you house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Note two things here just quickly. In Isaiah's invitation to Ahaz back in verse 11, he refers to God as your God, Ahaz's God. But here at the end of verse 13, Isaiah calls God my God. He's admitting that Ahaz, and by extension the nation of Judah, has rejected God's voice and his word and his help. They've rejected God's witness, you see, which winds up having enormous negative implications for Judah down the road. This event here, Ahaz's declaration of rejection, was in many ways the beginning of the end for Judah. It's so sad when you think about it, that what began as a visit of encouragement for Ahaz ends as a visit of warning and rebuke. And yet, the sign is still going to be given. And it was a sign that would not only speak to Ahaz's day as an act of redemption and mercy, it would also stand down through the ages, clear to the stable in Bethlehem. The sign that God gave to his people was, verse 14 there, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Immanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid to waste. The sign, you see, was still a sign of witness. Regardless of what Ahaz wanted, God's witness would remain, which meant that in the near future, God was going to bring victory over Israel and Syria. He would prove his witness in blessing in that way. But in the more distant future, because Ahaz and Judah rejected God's witness, they would suffer defeat at the hand of Assyria, the very nation, the very people in which they put their trust instead of God, you see. You get bit by the snake that you grabbed onto. The fact of Immanuel, God with us, remains. Immanuel remains. But God will always defeat those who stand against him. This is both the nature and the consequence of God being with us. His purity and his holiness can both bless us and burn us. It depends on where we are with him. Do we want him or not? Do we want his word? Do we want his truth? Do we want evidence of his reality in our lives or not? Will we be with him or not? That's the determining question. Because how we will be with him determines what happens when he is with us. It's been asked who the specific child Isaiah was speaking of in his day is. Who was that child? Was there a literal child? Some don't think there was a literal child. We imagine there was a literal child, or it would have made no sense in Ahaz's day at all. But we don't know who it was. It's also been asked, is the word there in Isaiah specifically virgin, or is it a young woman of marrying age? And how does that translate in through the Hebrew into the Greek, into the English, and all that stuff? You know, the reality is, according to Israel's moral standards, they are really one and the same. You would assume, if you were a Hebrew, that a young woman of marrying age was going to be a virgin. But even beyond that, there's never been any substantial challenge to the fact that the Gospels certainly describe in Mary a woman who had never experienced sexual intercourse. That just can't be explained that way. So with regard to Immanuel, the fact is, in some ways, it doesn't even matter. The fact and the consequence of Immanuel, God with us, they're the same. They're the same for us today as they were for Mary and Joseph in their day, as they were for Ahaz and the nation of Judah in Isaiah's day. If we choose to be with God, then Immanuel, God with us, will be a blessing to us. If one chooses, as Ahaz did, to reject God, then Immanuel, God with us, will wind up being quite a burden. And unless there's repentance on that person's part, that individual's part, God's withness will ultimately crush that person. Since God's presence always destroys those who resist him and steadfastly refuse him. And of course, that's why Matthew saw this word from Isaiah, the sign from God, as ultimately and comprehensively pointing to Jesus. Jesus is not just a sign of God's withness. Jesus is a lot more than that. Jesus embodies God's withness. The child born in Isaiah's day affected the nation of Judah for a time. The child born to Mary affects all peoples and all nations for all times. That's why Jesus is the definitive fulfillment of Immanuel, God with us. He is the sign for all to see, not just for one little nation and one little king in one place of history. Jesus is the sign for all to see, and he's the proof for all to consider. He's the proof of God with us. In fact, the whole thrust of the Gospel of Matthew is that very thing, God with his people. In how Jesus was conceived, how he was born, throughout his life, the miracles he did, in his love and compassion and healing, in his priorities and values, the way he taught, his wisdom, his knowledge, his manner with people. All of it, Matthew reports to us as evidence of God with us. God with us. And then Matthew leaves us at the end with the question, will we in faith believe the sign? Like Ahaz and so many of the both then and now nation of Judah. Will we reject the sign of God's witness and suffer the destruction that comes with that rejection? Or will we, like Mary and Joseph and Simeon and Anna and Matthew and all these others through the ages, will we, like them, by faith, see that God in Jesus was and will always be with us, and so embrace him in obedience and inherit the blessing of being with him? That is the challenge of Immanuel, God with us. That's the sign. The baby born miraculously to Mary and Joseph, he's the sign from God to help us, to guide us, to remind us and inform us, all for our good. And all of this stuff, these decorations, everything, all this that our culture that has grown up around the sign of the baby born to a virgin in Bethlehem, all of this also points to Jesus. And if we'll see it that way, it means that everywhere we look, particularly this time of year, we see all the trees, the wreaths, the flowers, the ornaments, they all become reminders that Jesus is with us, that God is with us. It all speaks to Immanuel. In whatever hard thing you may be going through in these days, I wonder if you've just prayed or maybe just said to God, God, would you just give me a sign that you are with me? They're all around you. They're all around you, especially this time of year, you know. Maybe we ought to keep the Christmas tree up all year. The signs are all around you because all of this points to the sign of Immanuel and to his witness with those who will be with him. Lord, we thank you for the way that you are with us and the reminders that you are with us, the signs that you have given us through your prophets and through the ages, and even today, maybe with a small s, the signs that the capital S sign encourages, even in our very, very secular culture. It all points to the fact that you are with us. Would you help us to take those by faith and recognize and realize and trust in your witness in these days? In Jesus' name, amen.